pop-up box that says recording in progress.
All right.
It's official. This is a podcast now.
Yeah, two friends doing a podcast.
Welcome to this week's episode of the QTB podcast. I'm Al, he, him, or they, them, and this is my co-host Lzzy.
She, her, hers.
And this week we are going to be talking about sex, pleasure, and consent, and we'll be following this up with a part 2 at some point about relationships. I am not a complete expert. I'm not a sex expert, but I do have a ton of research, and I'm going to give a quick trigger warning that in this episode, we're going to be discussing controversial topics of sexual activity, as well as sexual health, and then topics of criminal behaviors such as sexual assault and rape, hereafter referred to just as SA and hard R SA. A thorough set of life experiences, talking about sex, pleasure, and consent, and education as well.
It's the day you've been waiting for.
It is. I love this. I could do this full time every day of my life forever and not be bothered in the slightest. It's so much fun. We're going to dive right in to a brief history of sex education in the United States for the purposes of consistency. When I say things like cis-het society, I mean the dominant society that we live in, because that is a cisgender heterosexual society with a heteronormativity issue. In the US education system, sex is defined as in an overly narrow way, and sex education is targeted in most states at this point, and up until maybe the last 5 years, has always been narrowly focused on penis and vagina, intercourse or coitus. Those both mean the same thing, penis and vagina, sexual activity, for the sole purpose of procreation or making babies. And sex education has been around in public schools in the United States since the early 1920s. It was introduced in the 1920s as a way to proactively teach sex ed and sexual health in regards to STDs, like the common STDs of the time being gonorrhea, chlamydia, and syphilis. The history to that is hilarious. Soldiers were getting syphilis in World War II, and they needed to teach them safe sex practices. So this is what they came up with, is adding sex ed.
But only to the men.
But yeah, only to men. And it was really only about not getting an STD or an STI. That's all that was about. For those of you who are listening who have gone through school, when I was in school and sex ed was a thing, it was still an STD, a sexually transmitted disease. It is, of course, more accurately defined as sexually transmitted infections, which can lead to disease. But if I say STD or STI, they are meant to be interchangeable. Sex education went on with a lot of nuance, and the courses were developed. College students started getting sex ed educations. Research into sex started happening, as we briefly discussed in previous episodes, like our book report episode. And funding started to be placed around sex ed from the 1920s all through the end about the 1950s. And then at the end of the 1950s into the 60s and 70s, when the free love era really took off, as one might say, the sex education became highly politicized in the United States. Funding started to disappear, and proponents of morality based sex education, which is just code for white upper middle class Christian people's versions of what should and shouldn't happen.
Be abstinent.
Oh, we're getting there. That those viewpoints, not unlike the lavender scare of the time, became dominant, and sex education became a hot button topic used in a moralities style manner to combat what is seen as immoral behavior, and talking about how sex education is helping people have more sex. But that's bad because, premarital sex at the time is bad. That continued on for many years. In 1981, Congress codified that into law with, I love this acronym. They passed the AFLA or AFLA, the Adolescent Family Life Act. I wish it was ALFA, ALFA. That would have been way more accurate. The AFLA was essentially codifying abstinence only, not education, but propaganda, into sex education curricula throughout the country. It mandated that the prominent educational piece be abstinence only or refraining from sexual activity. And it also removed a ton of really important comprehensive things, like basic comprehensive things from sex education for decades to come. And the US has never truly had a comprehensive sex education curricula, not at all. not even a little bit, but we were stifled, extremely stifled by the 1981 AFLA. In 1991, the guidelines for comprehensive sexuality education for kindergarten through 12th grade, which is our primary school days all the way up to before college, was published. In 1993, the Supreme Court of the United States, or hereafter SCOTUS, ruled that federally funded sex programs, sex education programs, have to delete, remove, and refrain from referencing specifically religion. Before that, essentially, it was always the moral arguments about don't have sex because morality. You can assume, if you understand anything about the United States and our Constitution, forcing one particular belief system on other people is unconstitutional and therefore illegal. And I could go into a rant for 78 days about how that still doesn't quite work in this country because we can't equally apply that concept. In 1994, the US Surgeon General, then Jocelyn Elders, endorsed teaching about masturbation. This is a highly educated doctor, was forced to resign as US Surgeon General because she said masturbation should be taught. She's correct, and that was terrible. In 2006, the Government Account Office, or Government Accountability Office, the GAO, published a report that abstinence-only programs were never vetted or researched before they were funded and implemented. Essentially, I'll take that as the part of the federal government admitted that it did fucked up, because when they enacted the 1981 law, it was due to essentially peer pressure and political pressure. It wasn't based on research that abstinence-only programs worked, because 25 years later confirmed what literally everybody else knew who has brain cells, is that abstinence-only education doesn't work. It simply tells people who have raging hormones not to have sex rather than telling them legitimately why they maybe should think before they have sex, and also doesn't teach them about condoms or STDs and STIs. It doesn't teach them about how to have safe sex or enjoyable sex, all the fun things. And I'll take that as the government did fucked up. We've continued to progress towards more comprehensive sex education across the United States, but that is actually, abstinence only is still a thing. It is still codified into law and it hasn't been removed. In 2008, then President Bush, the sequel, requested over $200 million for funding for abstinence only. Congress approved over $175 million. The Obama administration in 2009, at the changeover of things, was started to support comprehensive sex education. In 2011, a poll showed that 90% of US parents support sex education in high school, whereas only 75% supported it in middle school. We need to stop calling it sex ed and call it sexual health and well-being education, because there's a lot more to what we call sex ed than just penis and vagina intercourse. Like, you need to know how to care for your genitals.
Also, just like integrating it into general health classes, like all the way through your development, like, oh, your body's going to start changing soon before you get to like that preteen. So like, they're like, okay, I'm ready for this. I know what's going to happen. And like, making it a lifelong, instead of like, oh, you get to high school and you have to have these classes and this is the class that's going to tell you about your body, and then walking out being like, everything in my life has been a lie and I don't know what's happening.
Well, right. And truly comprehensive sexual health education is actually lifelong. So you would have a form of education about relationships and your body in, first grade, so that you know that you have a vagina and a vulva, or that you have a penis and testicles, or a variety of those things, because it's really important that children understand what their body parts are, so you don't have that situation where a child is trying to tell an adult that they're being touched inappropriately, but the only words they know for their genitals are euphemisms that don't sound like something bad is happening. It's incredibly important to prevent such things, to teach your children what their body parts are. If they only know that they're called their privates or their cookie or the whatever you want to call them, they're not going to be able to help themselves or tell you when something's wrong. Oh, I should also note that during the AIDS crisis, AIDS education, specifically educating on the effects of safe sex practices and catching of HIV and AIDS, was mandated in the mid 1990s for all states everywhere in the United States. So that was a plus, but like a small plus. From there, we want to kind of, we talk about sex, and I have repeatedly said penis and vagina, coitus, intercourse. Specifically, when you refer to the words coitus or sexual intercourse, herein intercourse, what actually is being referred to is just penis in vagina penetrative sex. And there's a lot more to sex than just that. That's what people commonly think of, especially if they're heterosexual and cisgender. That's what they're going to think of. But there's a lot more to sex than just penis and vagina or coitus. I have a very broad definition of what sex is because, as an incredibly queer person who's attracted to all the peoples, regardless of genitals of any kind or gender presentation, a lot of different activities could constitute sex for me, and not very many of them are going to include coitus. So I include in my definition of what sexual activity is and what sex is oral sex. That could be cunnilingus, analingus, or fellatio. Anal sex is sex. It is technically penetrative sex, just a different hole. I have called it kink sex is still sex. And what I mean by that is kink-based activities used in a sexual manner, because not all kinks have to do with sex. Sometimes you'll have different types of fetishes or kinks that aren't necessarily sexual. Kink performed for the act of arousal, I will include in the definition of sex. Mutual masturbation, where two people aren't necessarily touching each other, but just themselves mutually, where they can see and hear each other or whatnot. That is a form of sex. I also include foreplay in my definition of sexual experience because it is tantamount and paramount to the sexual activities for people who have vulvas and vaginas. Foreplay is a must, and if it is a must for enjoyable sexual experience, it's therefore a part of sex, in my opinion. It's a part of the experience. All of the things above could be included in foreplay: kink, anal sex, oral sex, mutual masturbation. Those can all also be categorized as foreplay, but in and of themselves, they are also just sex. Because especially if you're, say, a lesbian, the only way you might be having sex is through cunnilingus or oral sex. That might be the only way you choose to have sex, and that is sex. Does that make sense?
I mean, it does to me. And everyone's definition of what sex is going to be a little different, right? Like, so I agree with some of the things on here, but because of the type of relationship I'm in, like, I don't see everything. So my definition is going to be much smaller than what your definition is, right? So
Yes.
For me, I think the thing that stands out that for us, but is different, is probably the foreplay part.
Mm-hmm.
It's part for some, but not part for all. Like, I typically don't do foreplay.
Insert a cutout portion of this podcast where I just tell Lzzy and their partner that they need to have more foreplay. Just me. But I mean, in part of that is you might not actually realize that what you're doing is foreplay. You might not define what you're doing as foreplay. I mean, flirting can be foreplay for some people. If it creates a sexual arousal, it's foreplay. Insinuating that there might be sexual activity later can be foreplay. That's why I'll include it as a part of the sexual experience, because it is, and therefore it's a part of sex.
And I think it's just what each person's definition is going to be different and what they include in it.
Right, precisely. But we can't say that other people's kinds of sex aren't sex, is the point, really.
Correct. So, I mean, would be a good chance for like listeners to think about like, what is sex for them? Because that is going to be different. And you can bring that up too with the person that you'll have sex with or your partner, because those can be different things, like how they want to go about doing it, how they identify what sex is, if they do foreplay. Like, there's a whole like list of things that you need to talk about before. It's much broader than, the bar scenario, right? Where you're like going to a bar and then you're leaving home with someone and then just having sex right away. Like, that is not typical.
People do that. I don't know very many people who do that, but people do in fact do that, and that's their behavior and their prerogative. Not everybody is like that. The next chunk here, I don't have any good smooth transitions, is the myth of virginity. When we're talking about sex, we also have to talk about your first time, and there is an invasive myth. It's an invasion of lies, is that virginity is a thing. It's a social construct. There's no body part, we'll get to that shortly, that determines if you've had sex. There is almost no way to tell through physical exam if someone has had any kind of sexual activity unless it causes trauma and damage to their anatomy. So when you look at a TV show like Law and Order SVU, they'll say they do a rape kit and they're trying to check to see if someone's experienced the hard R. But like, that's not how it really works, because, for example, if a person who's assigned female at birth and has a vagina and a vulva is examined on a medical table, both of us do today, is examined on a medical table, they'll put a speculum, basically just a fancy vagina opener in and look at you to see if there's seminal fluid or if there is damage to the vagina. But it's not, you're not going to open it up and be like, oh, the hymen is torn, so clearly there's been activity, they're not a virgin. That's not how it works, because sex should never be painful unless you specifically want there to be pain involved. Sex should never be painful, and you shouldn't have any kind of bleeding or discomfort while having sex. And so the idea that you can look at somebody's genitals and say, well, they're no longer a virgin or they've had sex recently is a complete lie. It's not a myth. It's just a fucking lie. It's used to control people, particularly assigned female at birth. We do this all the time in society with slut shaming, with the stigma and shame surrounding premarital sex. There is currently a lawsuit in place against a Christian-based company, big air quotes, that has fired numerous people for having premarital sex because the company purports to have religious beliefs. Pretty sure I cut it out of one of the last episodes, but companies are not people and therefore do not have belief systems. Don't discriminate. There's also the stigmatization that survivors of SA and the hard R are tainted. That comes from the previous two, slut shaming and premarital sex. That's all that's applied into that idea. That's why when we talk about the right to terminate pregnancy, abortion rights, we have people always talk about if there's going to be a restriction in a state about how someone can have an abortion, they always talk about having an exclusion for survivors of sexual assault and incest. They talk about having those in there because those are things that the survivor literally had no control over. Mm-hmm. And different states define the hard R and sexual assault differently. Again, I talked about this briefly, but the hymen, which is a piece of tissue inside of the vaginal canal near the opening of it, is not a sign of virginity. It's a remnant that was inside of the vagina while we were in utero, while we were wee babies developing, still cooking in the oven. It is not a sign of virginity. It should not be torn or broken during sexual activity unless that's your goal. And I don't know anybody who would want to do that. But the pervasive thought in the US is that if a hymen is broken, someone's not a virgin. You literally can't tell. The vagina can stretch itself to be over 10 centimeters in diameter. I am a big proponent that everybody should use lube for all sexual activity and also foreplay.
And it's really important for us to think about too, like when these two things are being said, you know, like all this, let's say, shaming, premarital sex, that the hymen exists to be broken, is like looking at women and saying like, you don't have full control over your body and how you experience and what happens to you. And for women, losing any sort of control that you have just like shuts everything down, right? Like that's when lots of mental health stuff start creeping in, whether there's hard R or SA or not, because it's a power and control issue. Men are telling you what your body looks like, specifically hetero cis men. And so any sort of power that you have is very fundamental for any gender diverse people, women, assigned female at birth, whatever gender identity you have, including non-conforming folk as well. So it's just like taking, well, look, you have no power anymore. Like, this is great.
Precisely. And I didn't put it in here, and I'm just realizing this now, but I haven't talked about boobs. And as funny as that statement sounds, you haven't talked about boobs yet. Well, I actually should, because the most commonly stigmatized, shamed, and then also absolutely exploited body part of people who are assigned female at birth, the mammaries. The stigmatization of breasts while also exploiting them in the media for advertising and things and control is just obnoxious. Like every time I'm in public now, I wear a shirt that's extremely low cut or with buttons. So why are you showing your tits? You shouldn't be showing them in public. Well, guess the fuck what? I've got some boob confidence and I'm going to do it anyway. And it has nothing to do with your sexual desire.
Yeah. And if you show too much and like going out in public, right? Like, you get looks, you could get hit on, and like so I'm speaking about assigned female at birth women specifically,
right?
That catcalling is a part of women development.
It's just expected. It's disgusting.
You expect it from very early on because you watch it happen to other people, and then it happens to you. You finally feel like you've become a woman because you've been catcalled.
Mm-hmm.
It is literally part of gender identity development for a woman.
Teenage girls, children get catcalled by grown men.
I just want to put that out there.
It's disgusting. It's really fucking disgusting. As I've said, sex should not be inherently painful unless your intention is to experience pain while experiencing pleasure. Kink things. Lube, 100% necessary, even if you think you are a gusher of moisture. Please use lube. Foreplay, 100% necessary, even if you don't think so. If your body is aroused, that means you've engaged in some kind of foreplay. And then anal sex as well. Any kind of anal activity shouldn't be uncomfortable or painful. If it is uncomfortable and painful, well, okay, I can't entirely prevent discomfort because sticking something up a butthole where it's not supposed to go up can be uncomfortable, but it shouldn't be painful. If it is, you need to take it more slowly and you need more lube. If you think you have enough lube, add more.
And also telling the person,
well,
like, this don't feel good.
Yes. Communication while engaging in sexual activity is key. And I'm so used to that being an implicit part of the activity and an explicit thing that that's second nature to me. So my apologies. All of this stuff is what needs to be verbally communicated and agreed upon, which leads us right into my next topic, consent. You may have seen the beautiful YouTube video that was the cup of tea analogy. So, you don't force a person to drink a cup of tea. If they say no, they don't want a cup of tea. If they're unconscious, you don't make them drink a cup of tea. It's a basic idea to explain consent, but it's not 100% perfect. It does have some pitfalls in that there's a gray area to consent that we're only just starting to socially define and acknowledge. And it's really the concept of negotiation and the withdrawal of consent during sexual activity. So, as I just said, explicit discussions should happen before you're engaging in sexual activity. I believe in that, full stop. And no, it doesn't kill the mood, because if you're talking about the sexy things so that you can both, that you and the person or people that you're engaging with all can enjoy it, I'm going to tell you, it's not going to kill the mood. You're going to get even more aroused while talking about it, because then you're anticipating the sexual activity. But you need to verbally confirm that you both have consent. It's not implicit. A moan is not implicit, because the human body can do things automatically, and that doesn't mean someone is necessarily okay with it. Verbally consent to a yes. Anything other than a yes isn't consent, in my opinion. Continue to ask for consent during the sexual activity. So especially if you're engaging in sexual activities that are new, like you're experimenting with fantasies, fetishes, or kinks, or you're engaging in sexual activity for the first time with a new partner, continuously making sure that, is this okay? Are you still having fun? Are you enjoying yourself? Am I doing this right? Does this make you feel good? Constantly asking to make sure that they are actively engaging and 100% want to participate in the activity. Because if at any point they no longer want to engage in an activity, that activity needs to stop and you need to renegotiate, whether that's, oh, this doesn't feel good, so you change what you're doing, or I no longer want to do this at all, and then it ends, full stop. There's no, well, but I need to come. No, 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 no. If the other person doesn't want to continue, it stops. Anything short of stopping becomes SA and hard R. It's a very gray area, because that can sound like a lot of work, but it really isn't in the moment. Especially if you're in a committed relationship with one or multiple partners, this is something you do and you've learned to do implicitly. You've learned each other's bodies, you've learned how to do that, and you're probably still going to communicate effectively in the bedroom. Not everybody uses words. I would encourage you to learn to do so. But as long as you continue to understand how each person works and that you are both consenting, it's about learning the two people and how you're going to communicate. Early relationships, please use verbal communication and explicit yes, no's. It'll make it a lot easier to avoid such problems. As I was talking about negotiating and boundaries, there is, of course, especially in the US, a debate about, well, what about when the person is drunk? In the state of Minnesota, for example, if you're drunk, it's your fault. That's literally the law right now. Yeah. Supreme Court case in that state just determined that being drunk is a pass on hard R. I fully disagree, and that law will change, and those people will not get reelected. I'm sure of that. But if you're going to be partying and you do have an idea that you want to engage in activity with somebody from that party, whether beforehand or while you're there, intoxication can impair your judgment significantly, especially if you're more intoxicated than you were when you arrived. And consent can be a little bit harder to understand because you're not fully there when you're intoxicated, whether that be through alcohol or drugs. And therefore, you're not truly able to consent to something, but you're not truly able to consent to something, but you still may do so. What I would recommend, and what I've seen other professionals recommend, is that you have an accountability buddy when you're going out partying. It's not necessarily the easiest thing to do because then you both want to party. But as long as someone is saying on the sober end of things so that they know and that you explicitly communicate your wishes, like, I don't want to be allowed to do any of this tonight, and that person is firm in being able to keep you from doing things that you don't want to do when you're sober, that's helpful. It's a hard subject to talk about because there's really no way to stop a person once they're past that point of being able to make a decision. But again, if you're no longer able to make consent because you are far too intoxicated to make a decision, you shouldn't. Another thing to talk about is going to be boundaries with consent and what's called stealthing, or just the removal of a condom and thus making it hard R. Because if part of your engaging in sexual activity is agreeing that a condom is mandatory, any variety of condom, and that any other contraceptive or protective devices are used, if those are removed without the express consent of both parties, it negates the consent entirely and is thus, again, hard R and SA.
Have you seen this much in our community, stealthing?
Yes, for a long time in the queer community, especially in for anyone who's out there saying, but condoms make it less sensitive, you're wrong. You can still feel all of the sensations. A thin sheet of either latex or natural fibers, if you're allergic to latex, is not going to dampen your nerve endings ability to feel that. It has to do with pressure and movement, and a thin sheet of latex or natural fiber is not dampening that experience. So if you're going to tell me that the condom makes it less enjoyable, you're lying to yourself and to others. I can fit my whole head inside a condom. Trust me, it's not too tight.
Now I would pay you to put your head in it.
I can show you YouTube videos of people who have done that. There is no such thing as a condom too small, and there's no such thing as that condom makes it less sensitive. That is bullshit. I'm not going to entertain the argument. We're going to just move straight on to pleasures, considering we're talking about how condoms make things less pleasurable, which is a completely false, and it's just a lie. Masturbation is normal. It's self-care. It's very healthy, and it can be very intimate, especially with mutual masturbation. I do recommend masturbating regularly, but that's me. Not everybody masturbates, and that's okay. However you feel comfortable masturbating, if at all, is what's comfortable for you, and therefore a part of your self-care and your healthy process. Now, if you're a person who chooses not to masturbate because you think it's dirty, or because you think that if you're already in committed relationships or a committed relationship, that masturbation is wrong because your partner should be satiating your needs, all of those things are false. Masturbation is completely normal. Masturbating while in a relationship is completely normal.
Mm-hmm.
If your partner says you shouldn't be masturbating, they're controlling, and I'm not okay with it.
That's a form of control that should be negated.
There you go. Masturbation is totally normal. There's nothing wrong with masturbating while in a sexual relationship with someone else. If you feel the need to masturbate more than have in other forms of intercourse, perhaps you should explore mutual masturbation, which is masturbating at the same time in the same space, or using a mode like FaceTime or whatever to see each other doing that. Sex for pleasure is just as real and just as valid as sex intended to make babies, by the way. I haven't stated that enough as it is. You do not need to be having sex solely for the act of making babies. Lots of people choose to do that, but also some people's only goal is to have pleasure from sex. They just want to enjoy themselves and they have no intent of ever making babies. Totally cool. Equal footing, those two things. Now we're going to talk about some sociosexual control, as I'm going to call it, and the history of it. Basically, we're going to talk about religion and patriarchy. Patriarchy
is... we haven't been talking about that at all.
No, we've just been layering those things on without talking about them, without like giving them names, essentially. So, patriarchy is a system of society or government in which the father or eldest assigned male at birth is the head of the family, and the lineage of control remains in the assigned male at birth thing. So, your sons. In that, women are largely excluded from ever holding control directly. They're meant to be subservient. They are usually to be controlled, and they are often controlled. Patriarchy is just overall bad.
Right. And so for some people, some households actually still continue with the patriarchy, but there's been a movement more recently to where women are holding more power within the home, because for centuries and generations of women have been, that's where they have their power and their control. And culturally too, there are some, I think it's like matriarchal societies as well. So we're going to exclude those and focus specifically on the United States, which uses patriarchy as a foundation for society, for family life. It permeates a lot of different areas of realm, right? Like,
right. It's also important to note, since you bring up matriarchy, a matriarchy is not a society dominated by women. It's not the same thing as a patriarchy. Matriarchy means equality. The actual functional definition of matriarchy is that is not that women are in charge. Lineage might be tracked more through females, but that's also genetically more accurate because of mitochondrial DNA and things. But that doesn't mean the social structure, the systems of power, rest solely on the assigned female at birth sexes at all. It just means that there's more equality than there is in patriarchy. Specifically talking about religion and patriarchy and colonialism and imperialism and lots of things. Short version. The short version is both patriarchy and oppressive religions. Again, almost entirely Judeo-Christian religions. That includes Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, and any variations underneath those. These two different systems of the systems of religion and the system of patriarchy have crossed the world many times over, shaping the global or AMAB-centric power structure of the world for millennia. Christianity's only been around for roughly 5,000 years in total.
For me, thinking about these topics, like, think of patriarchy as patriarchy has always existed, always, but religion is an extension that connects individuals with like an introduction to the patriarchy. Think about
Yes.
it in terms of that. So a lot of women get exposure to patriarchy through that, young children, gender diverse people, sexual diverse people. A lot of diverse peoples also have their introduction to systems through religion. And I think that's also a part of the reason why people are much more spiritual in comparison to organized religion.
Yes. So specifically when we say religion, we don't mean religious belief necessarily. It's not your belief in a deity. It's the structure of a system and an institution. Religion is a tool. The institution of religion is a tool that essentially has been propagated to give legitimacy and authority, the two components that create power, is to have legitimacy and authority, to assign males at birth who would like to contain power over others, which is, the whole of Western human history and much of the globe's human history. Religion is devised as tool. Organized religion has been a tool for a long time to control. That's what the structure exists for. It's to create a set of morals and boundaries and things that people live by. But it also has a dark side, because patriarchy and the idea of oppressing women and people who aren't white men. Just look at the Crusades as just a prime Western only example.
How did you know what I was thinking of? So with organized religion, I also think a lot about a couple of things. So I think about how people read the Bible. So if you read, as a person who has recently left Catholic, United Church of Christ, that kind of chain of Christianity, there's lots of different ways to read the Bible and how people identify with it or don't identify with it. There's lots of different ways to read it. So you can find power in it, but you can also find a lot of weakness in it and a lot of instructions about how women are supposed to act and less about how men are supposed to act. So as a woman, you can read that as like there's a lot more for me to do. But there has been a different way to read that, which is about liberation, about the freedom that can come from it. So that is where it's pushing now for a lot more people to go there, but patriarchy still is existing in it, and it's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. It's been a part of ostracizing so many different types of people for a very long time. And while they're starting to open up, they're also shutting down in different areas.
Religion and organized religion specifically has served to create marginalized peoples. There's no such thing as minorities because depending on where you go in the world, different groups have different major and minority population status. When we say minority, it's in reference to a group of people. It's usually in measure of control and power. And it's always white people that are at the top and that are the majority. But in reality, it's the dominant people and the oppressed and the marginalized, pushed to the margins. This probably won't make it into the podcast at all, but it's important to note that religion has served to do that. Really, the most important thing to note in this entire section of talking about patriarchy and religious institutions is the concept of how they've shaped the globe, how they've shaped our ability to understand our own sexual prowess and sexual selves, but also the phrase, the definition of power being that it's two-pronged. You need legitimacy and authority to have power. And that's what the institution of religion has given to largely white men through their millennia of effort.
Yes, and it permeates other cultures as well. Like it's literally modified how other cultures look at just not just male and female, but how their cultures had developed, and a lot of like shame towards their culture as well. And
colonialism, that's why we talk about this circumventing the globe several times over thousands of years, is because largely white men in largely Christian societies, have circled the globe, colonized the globe, and changed the belief systems of the people around it. Don't get me wrong, before there was Christianity, this was still happening to pagans and things, different types of pagans. In Europe is the place I know the most about. One thing remains the same. Since Christianity and organized institutional religion, white men have just used this as a means of changing the global landscape in their favor. And it's also important to note that the reason I say the institution of religion is because in the culture of the United States and Western culture, by the efforts of the institution of religion, the two things have separated. Religion is a part of culture. It's an inherent part of defining a culture. But in Western society, religion has been like the definition of religion and the functionality of religion has been separated from culture directly. And I can't speak to whether or not that was intentional or has just become a division because of how social structure has changed. I'd have to sit and think on that one for like years to come up with an answer to that question. But in other parts of the world, the belief systems and there aren't really as strong institutions of religion unless it's a transplant of Christianity or another Western religion, which is a good thing in my opinion. But those belief systems, those beliefs of faith weren't as institutionalized and bureaucratized as Western religions have been, particularly Christianity, like the behemoth of Catholicism. So that's going to conclude this chunk. Literally, this is the most boiled down to its like the reduction of how to talk about patriarchy and religion has made it into basically a thick paste because we've evaporated all of the detail out of it to keep it succinct. We'll talk about that in length at another time. My favorite section of this entire podcast is the discussion about an orgasm or about the orgasm. There are different types of orgasms, whether they stem specifically from physical stimulus, and then there's the neurological happenings of the brain of the orgasm. Do they ultimately come together and all work to be one type of orgasm, but in different areas? Yes. Like previously in the book report, we talked about how in the past we assumed that people assigned female at birth had immature and mature orgasms, and that clitoral orgasms were different from vaginal orgasms, among other things. It's all the same chemical process in the brain, but you can have orgasms based on different parts of your body, and you can have orgasms with different intensity. Not every orgasm is the same, and it doesn't necessarily produce the same physiological body response depending on how intense it is. There are essentially different subtypes of orgasms. An orgasm is still an orgasm, but there are different subtypes as to how you may be best able to achieve it. And in the case of people assigned male at birth, there is talk about different physiological types of orgasms that I don't know very much about and we'll learn about later, because I sat through a 2-hour long documentary about the structure of a penis. I think I can survive listening to podcasts and doing research about male orgasms and ejaculation.
Part 2. We'll have an update in part 2.
Oh, we might not have an update by part 2. But it's, especially in the United States, it's commonly assumed, it's an implicit part of sexual activity, is that the goal of sex is to have an orgasm. If you're a man, if you're assigned male at birth, it's almost an afterthought if you're assigned female at birth. In healthy relationships that are sexual in nature, it's usually the like quote unquote best thing in sex is if you have mutual orgasms or reaching a climax at the same time during sexual activity. All of those things are okay, but they are also not 100% true, and they are certainly not the default. Many people can't have mutual orgasms just because of the way one might be having sexual activity. It doesn't allow for that. Some people simply struggle to achieve orgasm as quickly as other people do. Typically speaking, people assigned male at birth or people with penises tend to be able to orgasm more quickly through their normal stimulus, which is just essentially applying circular pressure to their penis, aka anything insertive or using your hand, or literally almost any stimulus could be defined as that. People assigned female at birth, people who have vaginas and specifically vulvas and clitori, I'll find out which is correct and let you know, might not be able to have an orgasm with any kind of penetrative means, period. And particularly in the way particularly with clitoral stimulation, not all orgasms are created equal, and overstimulation can do exactly the same thing as understimulation and literally ruin the moment. You may be unable to reach an orgasm because you're overstimulated, and it's no longer the cocktail of things that need to be happening in the brain aren't going to happen in the way you want them to produce an orgasm. So that's why communication is so important, and taking time when necessary and being okay with, well, maybe that's not going to happen today, because sex is still pleasurable without an orgasm. Sexual activity can still be enjoyed without an orgasm. It's not necessary for every encounter of sexual activity to have one. It's certainly, of course, fun, but it's not the only fun part. And it's 100% okay if it's something that doesn't happen every time. It's not the goal. It's totally healthy to not have an orgasm. I don't know if I can explain it in another way.
I want to point out that you said cocktail.
Yeah, so are you, because of the word cock?
Yes.
Do we need to have a moment where I just use all of the euphemisms in a row?
Because you did. Because you did. I thought it was funny that you were talking about like male
genitalia, and I said cocktail.
And then you said cocktail. It felt like a purposeful pun.
No, it wasn't a purposeful pun. It was an excellent description of the mixture of chemicals in the brain. It's a cocktail. It just happens to have the word cock in it.
I thought you said it on purpose. I swear to God.
No, I may be a 12-year-old and will laugh at that, but when I'm in the zone, I won't laugh at it, because to me, it's not funny. In the zone, I am absolutely the person who will be able to say cunt with a straight face, and everyone else will feel awkward, and I'll just be like, what? It's the word cunt. It's a word. We could spend a year talking about why that makes you uncomfortable.
We could, and all of them personal. All of them personal reactions.
We'll get there. But so the best way to describe it is that there's a social expectation to reach an orgasm in the form, a climax in the form of an orgasm. And it, unfortunately, it has the worst impact on people assigned female at birth, because it is just generally harder for people assigned female at birth with vulvas to reach an orgasm, given the situation where there's typically their sexual partners, particularly if their sexual partners have penises, haven't usually been raised to care much of it all about their sexual pleasure. And that creates problems. Unfortunately, it's led to a lot of people assigned female at birth to believe that they have a sexual dysfunction, that they have a problem because they can't. And that's simply not true. There are sexual dysfunctions that sometimes need clinical intervention, whether that's medical or therapeutic, but that's not inherently all of them. Genuinely, it could just be that your partner's not paying attention to you enough and that you guys need to communicate more effectively. It just depends. There's not something wrong with you if you struggle to have an orgasm during sex. It's just not true.
And it doesn't automatically assign value to you as a partner, because I
Right.
think, like, speaking from my own experience of just like feeling like if you don't do well in the bed, that it means like the rest of your relationship is like ruined, or like that you're not meeting needs of someone
Right.
else, especially for people that are assigned female at birth. It becomes like you place a lot more value on that than what is necessary. Like, it's not about like that one thing is going to ruin everything else. It was like, oh, maybe it just didn't happen today, and living with that.
You bring up an excellent other point about what is being successful in the bedroom, is talking about orgasm, but also what is performing well in the
Yes.
bedroom.
Yes.
What, please someone to give me an operational definition so that we can research what performing well in the bedroom means, because that you're going to struggle real hard to give me something that makes sense.
Even I have no idea. That differs from partner to partner. It's just, yeah, whatever they come to terms with. There's no like
Yeah.
set definition of like, oh, this is what it means to do well.
The correct answer is that is something to be determined by the sexual partners and to be continuously reevaluated through explicit communication. Is there a theme here about communication?
Masturbation and communication. That's what we should call the episode. Masturbation and communication.
But masturbation and communication is accurate. Genuinely, for some people, masturbation is the only way they can reach an orgasm. So again, mutual masturbation can be fun.
Mhm.
We just, bring out your inner voyeur. I think this is where we can call it for the day. We will have to do a part 2 and talk more about relationships in the future, because queer relationships, of course, is a thing to talk about, and we'll squeeze that into the calendar at some point. But I really enjoy talking about sex, not in a gross pervert way, just in a sex is important to talk about kind of way.
The education of sex.
Whoa, the education of sex. People need to know about sex. What?
Crazy. And we're still kind of, I feel like, stuck in 20s. Like,
Yeah, I mean, 100 years have happened and we've learned goddamn nothing.
yep. We've learned that the government did us bad, but we're pretty much still in the same place.
This has been the QTB podcast. We will see you guys next week. And then the week after that, we're taking a break to give ourselves time to get caught up in pre-records and things and get ahead on editing. Editor Al is very tired. And then we will be back again after the 23rd. We're going to be back again on August 6th. And in August, we're going to be talking about laws and the community, the queer community. So that's going to be some deep conversations and a lot of research. So we need some time to prep. But again, we're going to be, our next episode, aside from this one, will come out on July 23rd. And then on July 30th, we will not be having an episode, as we will be taking a break from publishing an episode to get a little bit ahead.
So what's our next one? What are we doing next time?
Our next episode is going to be on the fat pathology and ableism. So we're going to be going back to talking about body image a little bit, but specifically regarding people who are classified as obese, morbidly obese, who would consider themselves fat, the medical community, and how ableism plays into it. So there's going to be a lot, and it is going to be a little bit more intense, and we're going to spend a good amount of time talking about the body neutrality and body positivity.
And toxic positivity.
Toxic positivity. Okay. So again, this has been the QTB podcast. We will see you guys next week, and then we'll be having a nice break. Enjoy your summers. Anything else you want to add, Lzzy?
No, I don't really have much of anything, but everyone go masturbate now. You didn't see that coming, did you?
No, I didn't. That one got to me. Have a great week, guys. Have some good adult self-care. And don't forget to ask for consent.